Hi, everyone. This is Irene Burgess with the Maine Cheese Guild, the executive director of the Maine Cheese Guild. And we're doing part two of looking at what happens when your farm gets turned over, or you're buying a farm from somebody or inheriting a farm from somebody who has been doing farming in the past. And Kate Turcotte, who is from Land for Good and is the main field agent for Land for Good, is leading this session. So let me turn it over to Kate. Hi, Kate.
Hello. Yeah, and last week we kind of went over, I did a presentation of just kind of overview of farm and business succession planning. And so this week we were hoping that people were going to review the documents and come with all of their questions. And like I said, I'm going to also, some people might be joining, but, feel some of the question. But we have Lucy Weiss from Maine Ag Mediation Program. That's for a part of the Maine Extension. And Lucy is a mediator, educator, and trainer. And I feel like we're going to be like linking everyone to the resources. But for me, one of the reasons why I wanted Lucy to join this conversation was because we've been talking a lot about the kind of the technical skills and the soft skills. I was kind of hoping that she could kind of speak to some of those soft skills, talk about the resources that are available at Maine Ag Mediation. They also do succession training and planning as well. And also she's a certified farm succession coordinator, so has kind of has that experience and the background of thinking about this in the larger level context. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Lucy, but and then I'll say to Paul Dillon, we've actually, like I said, we've never met, but I know that Land for Good has worked with you for a very long time in the past. And Paul is licensed in Maine as an attorney and counselor, and he's been, I've had an old bio and he updated, been doing this for 42 years. And I'm still looking about 42 years. I had 34, so that's how long we've been working with you. We had to update the bio, but so his practice is in business, estate, elder care, and charitable planning, and his office is located in Corinth, and he works with individuals, families, business owners, farmers, woodlot owners throughout the state of Maine. So thank you guys so much for being a part of this. We really appreciate it. I think also too, I mean, like I said, I'm happy to kind of get the ball rolling, but Jean, I don't know if you have any questions. I want to leave the floor for you because you are the member of the Maine Cheese Guild that's currently present. So
yeah, no, I guess, yeah, I mean, you brought up some ideas that I hadn't really thought about. It was just tax. I mean, at the moment it doesn't affect us, but we should be aware of a whole lot of things that we aren't aware of. So it's good to go through this. I have done it. We did I think a Land for Good one maybe 5-6 years ago. But it's certainly always good to think of what questions can come up and what effects, to look at.
I think even, that was one of the things I kind of want to talk about. I mean, when we're talking about farm succession planning or business planning, it's really the transfer of assets and income, and then there's also the manager side of things, but that's kind of one thing from one generation to another. And I think Paul, I don't know if you want to just kind of even provide like an overview of just some of kind of like the support systems that you would help people with, like say just from this perspective of someone who's looking to pass their farm to another family member, or to someone that isn't a family member, maybe some of the kind of structures and tools that you would ask, maybe people asking specific questions to start. But yeah, just kind of like where you would begin with people who are coming to you with support with that.
Okay, so essentially when I meet with people, I tell them as we sit down, because they're all very nervous, whatever we're talking about. And I always tell them, we're just going to have a conversation. We're just going to talk about what is it you want to have happen, what you're afraid will happen, what you hope will happen. Get those things out on the table. And that's where someone like Lucy really comes in, because the other thing I have to tell people is transferring a farm is not like selling a widget factory. So when you're selling a widget factory, it's just, okay, what are the assets? How much are they worth? I'll write you a check. It's all done. There's no emotion typically in that transaction. However, as all of us know, that emotion is the biggest thing that drives farming, and it also drives the succession planning. And I have successfully used mediators in family transitions to help them work through. And in some of those cases, and Lucy, you could probably address this better, but in some of those cases, it takes years of mediation and conversation and aggravation and upset and people storming out of the room and coming back before, you know, things get settled. So I like to let people know that there are ways that we can address their concerns without causing them to lose control or without causing them to feel like they're being taken advantage of by either generation, the younger generation taking over, the older generation moving out, or if it's a non-family member who's coming in. And so in that conversation, as you laid out in the workbook, I'm sure you talked about that last time, is there are several questions that people need to think about and be serious about as to what really is going to happen in this transaction. And what I try to do is, my clients typically are the people who are transitioning out. And if they are, then I like to have a meeting just with them so they can be honest about their emotions, their situation, their wishes, their hopes, their expectations. And I always tell them, I'm not going to tell the other people what you're saying, but if you have real concerns about, are they capable of taking over, or I don't like the way they manage things, or I would have a hard time following them around the farm, seeing them do things differently, then we can talk about those things and get those things out, because the more specific we can be, the easier it is for me to help design a plan. Okay, does that help as kind of an intro? Because we can get into more details about how and what things are done. You know, as you mentioned, I've been doing this for 42 years, the last 32 here in Maine. And because we live on an old farm in Exeter, and our neighbors are all either chip potato farmers, corn growers, dairy farmers, or whatever, that it kind of evolved into this practice where I have probably 25 or 30% of my clients are ag related, whether they're farmers, dairy farmers, vegetable farmers, blueberry farmers, fishermen, lobstermen, loggers, that whole spectrum of people, but they all have similar situations in terms of how do we transition the older generation out and the younger generation in and still make it work for both.
That's a really, thank you for that foundation. I was gonna kind of ask about that piece as far as what you kind of talked about with like the tension, soft skills, like trying to figure out the vision and the goals. Is that something that, I mean, even if there isn't a conflict, I guess, how have you used mediators? I mean, you, Paul, as far as how have you, over the years, how have you found success using mediators and facilitators in this process? Like, has that changed over the years? I think that that's something that I know that I want to ask Liz the same question too. We've kind of talk about is when to kind of bring up that conversation, like when to, I think a lot of times we think of it as like when we start it, when we realize there's a tension, but I think that there's a real value in starting in that place of just like, yeah, like having that, what is the vision for this transaction? You know, I think, yeah, how do you work with that?
Well, part of it is that I am professionally paranoid, so I'm always thinking what's the worst that can happen. But I'm dealing with ag people and farmers, which are very optimistic. So it's always going to get better. There's never going to be a problem. Nobody's going to have a conflict. There's not going to be an issue. So early on, I let them know that if we have any kind of concern, it doesn't have to be antagonistic. It could just be, I don't feel comfortable, is what they'll say. I don't feel comfortable turning it over. And then I can bring up the fact, well, we have available mediators who can sit down with both sides and talk it out and see what particulars are positive or negative in the situation. And then the goal there is to get those things in writing. That way, 3 or 4 years down the road, when the succession is happening, and older generation says, I thought we agreed you weren't going to do such and such in the barn. And then the younger generation can say, no, that's not how I remember. And then we go back to the written document and it says, A, B, C, this is how it was going to happen. And that way, that kind of releases that tension and allows them to remember that, you know, we've worked hard to get to this point of putting it on paper. And that's why we have it, is so people will remember what really was said, not what they remember or misremember, as Roger Clemens would say. So, I think so the mediators are available. My issue has been that, in all sincerity, sometimes it's hard to find a mediator, and that's where Lucy would be a great resource now. Once you latch on to a mediator that you really like, then when different things come up, you'll bring them back into the different situations because you can tell how they're going to react, how they're going to respond, how they're going to work, you know, well together with the client. So it's always out there. I don't push it. I generally bring it up when it's obvious that we're not going to make progress unless we get people to be honest. And I have to admit, I'm a lot different than most attorneys. I look at what I'm doing as a relational situation where I'm building relationships with the clients and not a transaction where it's just, okay, we got the thing signed, we decided what we're going to do, we signed it, it's over, I'll see you later, I won't talk to you again. So a lot of my time is spent in my initial meetings having these conversations where other attorneys are expecting people to come to the table, and that's just how other people operate, but expecting people to come to the table with all the answers already and not rely on the attorney to walk them through it.
Lucy, I'd love to hear what you have to say and add to that. I'll also say too, Lucy's also an attorney. This is like a nice mix of like nonprofit people, cheesemakers, and attorneys. This is like we're representing a real fun group here.
Yeah, Paul and I are more like the handshakes, hugs, and high fives attorneys, which is great. There's a wide range of attorneys. Some of the jokes are true. But it's that human side of things. Yeah, Paul, that really, thank you. I feel like Paul could be our hype man like any day. Like he was just like
Absolutely.
singing the praises of mediation. I find too that like even the term mediation, people have heard that term, but they don't know what it is. So mediation is a form of conflict resolution where there's either co-mediators or a single mediator. We actually have a co-mediator model, which is super cool. So there's multiple people in the room, more eyes, ears, and experience. And great to connect with people in the room, but also with each other and our staff. So they're there not to be a judge or a jury, not to tell somebody that they're right or they're wrong, like our traditional adversarial or legal system. It's someone there to help facilitate difficult conversations, lend support. We don't give advice, we give information and resources. Ethically, we're not allowed to give advice. So that's where like someone like Paul would come in as an attorney or other content experts like tax attorneys, CPAs, financial advisors, or business advisors. They're the ones who give advice. We're just trying to connect people to those kinds of folks. Even if we know a little bit about it, that's, yeah, ethically and professionally not what we do. We're there on the people side of things. So, yeah, I'm gonna, I think, reflect back a little bit of what Paul said and also just reframe it how we do. We do the same thing. We talk with folks one-on-one to start to learn a little bit about their goals, their interests, their needs. Oftentimes it might be the problem that's presenting itself, but oftentimes there's layers that we're peeling back. And yeah, what's behind that? I don't feel comfortable. And being able to have those conversations in a space where maybe the other stakeholders or people involved in the transaction or the transition aren't there yet. We do have that luxury in sometimes with mediation, people go straight into a mediation session. Well, with agricultural mediation, we actually have pre-meetings, and you do an intake with our case and data manager first, just so, and then see if everybody's on board to have a chat, and that's the mediation. And then before, after the agreement to mediate, where people are kind of understanding and learning about what mediation is and isn't, then there's pre-meetings. And so you're getting to know the mediators, they're getting to know you without that frenemy, that person that's right, causing so much strife and vice versa, or that group or whoever. And then maybe there's some homework, maybe there's some things that need to, some information that's missing. Maybe there just needs to be more sussing out of what are really the goals, the interests, and needs. And then eventually we would get to a mediation. And a mediation is where all the stakeholders come together. And again, the mediators are going to stay neutral, or I like to say multi-partial. We're there for everybody. We're not there for one person. Just to give you a little background on our program, we've been in Maine since 2004. We've been in extension since about 2019, along with a nonprofit, family and community mediation. In 2022, we've come fully in-house in extension, and that's where I come in. I'm the first director in extension. I feel lucky to be in this position. We get to offer this. This is a USDA program that actually started during the farm crisis of the 1980s, where extreme debt was and mental strain, right? Mental health tends to be the third person in the room, either if it's chronic or momentary because we're stressed out because these transactions are hard and complicated. And so that's, yeah, kind of where it came from. But we help with, succession is a big one. Family farm transfer is one of our most common cases, and it comes to everything from divorce to partners who were unmarried, partners either in life and or business, and then dynamics have changed for the sale, and then also succession or transition to the next generation or a member of the team, right? A non-family member. So this is something that we do. Kate, did I answer kind of what you had asked?
Yeah, so I like too what you said as far as like trying to assess people's goals, interests, and needs too, because I also think that there's people are coming at it from different, like some people need to transfer the farming business because they actually physically can't do it anymore. I think that what you guys are both touching on is really just kind of assessing why people are having to do this. Some people are really excited about going and retiring to Florida. I mean, it's like you never really know like why people are, starting this process. I think either this is kind of for both of you. What have you seen in the past are some of the things that are like the greatest like sticking points in this? I mean, top of my head, like people get really stressed out about, like taxes, estate planning, all that kind of stuff. Like, what are some of like the things that have you found have been like some of the greatest challenges in in this?
I'm going to talk to the people side of things. I think it's generational perspectives. And I'm wading into this. I am as old as Paul has practiced. So I am very much still a novice and a rookie at this. I do think I'm an expert in working with people, but as far as like the specific area, but I think what I've learned about in my succession coordinator training is the differences of perspectives, and also to the idea of the separation. Often there isn't a lot of separation or absolutely no separation between family and business. And that can be really, really tricky. And so not saying that we're trying to sever anything like that, but the idea of helping people develop business practices that are maybe separate from sitting around the dining room table on Sunday afternoons with family dinner. The idea of, I mean, things are personal. Obviously, farming is both a business and a lifestyle, but the idea of, helping people define what's family and what's business, specifically the business family, right? You do you. And support and tools to help have some of those difficult conversations. Not to say that there isn't support or would be mediators there, or those possibilities couldn't be there, but the idea too of these difficult conversations, like what do they look like? What do they feel like? What's the setup for them? What do we wear even? I learned that in my mediation training. There was one of the instructors said that One family, they dress up for their business meetings. That's their way of like getting in that frame of mind of we're talking business. So there's all kinds of different strategies. There's no right or wrong or good or bad. It's the idea of figuring out what works for each family, each farm, each team. So that's kind of the people side of things that I think we're trying to help develop and define. And it might be defined, it might not be, but the idea of, yeah, trying to develop those skills.
I agree, and I think that's something that I've been thinking about is in a lot of the stuff that we teach at Land for Good is we talk about like the family meeting or like the team meeting, you know, kind of like when to have those and when to have it. And I think that one of the things I've been kind of thinking about a lot is having someone to facilitate that conversation, like right when you start the process, because it really does break up that dynamics that might, you know, exist in the family or even might already be existing from generation to another. And just to have someone there to kind of be starting the conversation in a different light, you know, so I think that that's great.
Structure too, right?
Yeah.
Because we go off on tangents, we're humans and stuff. Yeah. It gets one of the phrases that the trainers oh gosh, our trainers are just so good. And one of them is my peer out in Iowa, and another is works for Wisconsin Extension. They call it the messy middle, right? To start create that structure because it's likely going to get a little uglier before it gets better. And I know between Paul and I, we're not selling this whole thing, but really, it's it's we don't want to lie to people. Not
No.
talking about conflict doesn't get rid of it, and talking about it doesn't create it. And so I think even that term too, conflict, I like to use the term even friction points too, because a lot of times it isn't people throwing haymakers or actually getting into physical or verbal confrontation. Often it's like the silent, right? It's the little bit different. So conflict or like friction points can look all kinds of different ways. But they're uncomfortable and people are uncomfortable with uncomfortable. But anything worth doing is often challenging. So there it is.
Yeah.
Mm.
Paul, how about you?
Pointing out-
Yeah, same question as far as like some of the things that people have challenges with and the stickiness.
Right, so pointing out, like Lucy pointed out, there's a difference between where I'm coming from ethically and where she's coming from ethically. And in my position, when I'm talking things out, what I'm trying to do is show people, all right, here are options as to how we can address the issue, whatever this particular issue is. Here are what's good about this option for you, what's bad about this option, how does it affect the other side? And that way, when I do give the advice, I'm really not telling them what to do. I'm saying, look, we talked about it, we went through it, you decided that this was the best option, and as adults, you made a decision and you're going to move forward. And that's important. I think the other thing that Lucy is saying, but to be more explicit, in my practice, the adult children do not want to talk about their parents dying. So in a farm practice, an ag practice, nobody wants to talk about the farm ending as we know it. And so that sometimes is what causes the conflict, is it's the older generation feels like something is dying or ending, and the younger generation's trying to say, no, we're gonna pick it up and we're going to make it better. But there's still that in the back of people's minds that they don't want to talk about, I'm taking over for you, Dad. And, you know, it's the famous, as you probably discussed last time, Kate, is, you know, someday this farm will be yours. And, you know, Dad's 85 and the son's 65. And it's like, Dad, you know, might be a good time to do this transfer now. Well, I'm not ready yet, says Dad. So that's part of an issue. Now, where was I going? There was something else that Lucy had said that made oh, I know. The other issue is that, I mean, I did not grow up a farmer. My wife's grandfather and his brothers in northern New Jersey, northwest Jersey, had a dairy farm and a dairy, and they bottled the milk and they delivered it to the homes back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And in those days, what happened was when the farm was ready to transfer, you basically could figure out a way for the next generation to buy out the older generation. So there's an income stream, there's retirement, they could rely on that as the older generation, the younger generation had the capability of paying. Well, that's totally upside down now. You can't afford, as a younger person, to get, you don't have credit, you don't have the financial ability. And so you don't have that easy transition that way. And that's why, again, I'm sure you talked about, Kate, as the idea that the younger generation has to think about retirement as any other normal person would think about retirement, setting aside funds, setting aside assets. And so that becomes part of the conversation. How are we going to support mom and dad? How are we going to support the younger generation? Are mom and dad going to stay on the farm? Are they going to move to Florida and be totally out of it? What's going to happen? And that's where, help from mediators is good, help from accountants to give ideas of how they can better their lives if they retire, that type of thing. So it's really a team effort as far as I'm concerned. Everybody does what they're good at, and that makes the clients better. Yes.
So Paul and I are just going to keep ping-ponging off of one another, but Paul,
Yeah.
when you were talking that I'm not ready yet, and that's, I think, and that's great. That's great self-awareness, but oftentimes people wait until a catalyzing event. And by catalyzing, I mean like something that pushes farm transition forward. Injury, illness, death, lack of financing. This seems to be a really common thing that I see in farm transitions. And catalyzing events are good because they get people moving, but they also, I don't think bad is the term, but it limits options. It limits options. So if people are able to do this if they can get themselves past the uncomfortable, they tend to have more options, rather than, so that's right, proactive versus reactive when something happens, often with the older generation, not always, but often. It makes it a little bit more complicated because you took those maybe 8 options and now there's maybe 1 or 2. So it does limit. So I think that that's something we could just say this till we're blue in the face, right? Proactivity tends to be trying to figure out how to get yourself ready and start making some steps, versus that freeze that often happens. And that's a human response. There's no shade when it comes to that. But that idea of action fights against that anxiety. So whether it's talking to an attorney like Paul or to your financial, or like advisor, or those small steps can be big steps because after a while that snowballs into, like Paul said, it often takes a couple years. So chipping away at this, if you do try to eat the whole elephant, you're not going to even come to the table. I think, right, it's that conflict, it's that avoidant nature that this is going to be hard and we want to push back against it, but it does allow for more options for people. Options that they may never even have thought of. That's the cool thing about mediation is when you get in there and you start talking and, as the mediator, as a mediator myself, I have that background, but also our mediators that we work with, they're the experts in mediation, but the farmers, who they're working with, the stakeholders, as I like to call them, right? Whoever, um, they're the experts, right? They know their farm, they know their family, they know their business, um, they know what they want. So they're the experts, and we're going to support them in that discussion, but it's their discussion. I always tell people, it's my mediation room, but it's your mediation. Like that idea of, we're not ethically, professionally, we can't give advice, nor would we, because we're not the experts. The experts in the room are the people that we're working with. And we defer to that expertise. I will also say too, that sometimes this isn't linear. Sometimes there needs to be like a stop or a start, or maybe a person's just not in a place to have that discussion. Sometimes we set down that discussion for 6 months or a year. That's not good, bad, or otherwise. Sometimes just people aren't there at that place at that time. Either they need to gather information or they need to digest it. So as the people who are the experts, they're the ones who set the pace. I didn't say this at the beginning, but it's we also work confidentially, which is super important. And mediation is completely voluntary. At least in our context. Sometimes with court mediation, it's ordered, but even in the court context, people making decisions is completely voluntary. I also want to share too that the Maine agricultural mediation currently, we're no cost. And so that helps, right? Some of the team, and it takes a team, I think, as Paul mentioned, and Kate, and it takes a whole team of people with different areas of expertise. Some are paid experts, some, right? This is part of our work, it's included. So that's part of our USDA grant, is to help people have these difficult conversations. So yeah, currently we're at no cost. And so that's really helpful, I think, because the term I keep hearing in farming is close margins. And so we want people to allocate those financial resources towards experts like Paul or other tax experts or other people outside, and also include them possibly in our conversations. It doesn't necessarily have to be one person at a time. Sometimes if we get on a Zoom or in a room with several of the people on the team, we can really have great conversations, because now we're bridging the gap between the technical, the business side of things, and then the personal, interpersonal relationship side of things. So it doesn't necessarily have a format either, that you just go to one person and you get a little medal or a token, and then you move to the next person. Usually we're working together, and it is nice whenever we can all talk together too, because then oftentimes we're speaking the same language and not having to play the game of telephone.
I was also going to ask too, we've been talking a lot about family transfers and family, someone who might have an identified successor in the family, but what unique challenges or opportunities have you seen for farms or, businesses that don't have an identified successor and are looking for someone? I think that there's, I know that my husband breeds cows. He goes to all the farms in all of Maine, and I swear every single day he comes back and says, someone else said to me, like, hey, you want to take over my farm? I think that that's a really unique situation, because I think that when there's someone in the family that might be taking over, there's like a vision. There's obviously pros and cons. There's a vision, and then there also is the family dynamic. But I think that if you have a goal of either wanting to continue your cheese company, continue your cheese brand, or want to see your lamb farmed, I guess, like, what are some of the challenges or opportunities out there for people who are in that situation, that they don't have someone in their family that wants to take it over?
Well, a big part of it is finding someone, as we all recognize that that's difficult. And then, how do we say this politely? Distinguishing between those people who think they want to be cheese farmers or farmers of any kind, and those who really can do it, or who are willing to learn how to do it. And so, as part of the process there, again, being concerned about things that can go south, and just saying that, look, if you're going to bring this person on, you can't just give them a part of the business, because then if it doesn't work out, now they own part of the business and they have some say and control in what happens next. So there has to be some kind of an agreement, and preferably in writing, that explains these are what are going to be the duties and expectations from the new person, and this is the support and the information and background that the person who's trying to move out is going to provide. So there can be a transition, and then that transition also has to be at least initially recognized as a particular period of time. Now it can go faster or slower than that, but at least be planning on. So a lot of people, when they want to take over a business or they want to buy a business, they want to feel like they have a stake in the business. And this goes for family too, but we're talking about non-family right now. And why should they put in all the effort if they have no goal in mind or no end game in line that says, when I get to this goal and I've accomplished these goals, then the owner's going to turn this much over to me, or the entire thing over. And that's a whole other question. We'll get to that, Kate, is what that is that we're turning over. But so as part of those conversations, initially, the vetting is the biggest thing. And I'm sure, Lucy, you've heard of stories, and Kate, I know you've heard many, where people get started and a year into it, you think it's going great, and suddenly they wake up one morning and tell you they're not going to stay. And they just leave. And so that, and hearing those stories, as you know, farmers talk to each other. And hearing those stories, they become wary of taking that step. But
Or the other side, sorry to interrupt, the other side, I'll be the millennial here. The other
Yeah.
side where they've worked every single day for a whole entire year for very little. And then after the year, the farmer says, you don't have what it takes, And I think that's the other side of the stories, so yeah, I'd actually like, but because I don't want to forget, is there a legal structure for that? Because I do think that is like the messy middle side of things, or like, or maybe it's the messy beginning, I'm not quite sure. But about if you don't have identified successor, like what kind of like legal agreement and structure would you recommend to someone in that situation? Like what kind, I mean, like we're aware of leases, we're aware of purchase and sales agreements, but like, is there like other like tools, like legal tools and agreements and something in writing that can help support people in that to be really clear about what this is?
yeah, so you could, again, depending on your end goal, which is ideally you know that up front, it can either be a buy-in situation where you have a contract, and if the person does certain things that they are going to gain benefits. And then at the end of that year, I hear you, Kate, that I've heard that more than once too from the other side, saying that, I thought I did everything I was supposed to, and they still won't turn it over. But even in terms of calling it an employment agreement or almost like a contract for sale where you can buy into the business, but you're doing with sweat equity and time spent, and then you reach these goals, then a percentage is turned over, however that is, but it's got to be spelled out. And also, this is the difficult part, and that is, how do you define what is a good practice, and have you met that good practice? And if there's a way that you can get the older generation to say, look, if they can do A, B, and C, if they can keep the fields in a certain way and follow good agricultural practices and meet certain quota criteria for the product, whether it's in this case cheese, that those are measurable. So if they have a quality product and it has little or no negative, bad product that has to be tossed, that those are benchmarks that people can follow. Also, time spent, and that's another tough one, is because a lot of the older generation, I'm sure Jean doesn't have this issue. She probably doesn't work 24/7. She just works from, she gets up early, so she'll work from 8 to 4, like people in town. And then the millennials come along, and yes, they work hard, but they're not working 24/7. They have families. They want to have their children. They want to be involved and do things. So those things, as benchmarks are established, if the benchmark takes half a day to get it done versus an entire day to get it done, as long as it's done, that should be a way of measuring it. And I guess it's like anything, if you think about it, is if you set a goal and it's got to be a measurable goal, somehow be able to calculate it and then be able to have somebody look at it and say, yes, this goal has been met. And maybe at that point, again, just because, Lucy's on the call here, and that could be a point where 6 months into it, you bring the mediator in and the mediator says, let's look at this objectively. I have no, stake in this. And according to this agreement, it says, if you produce this much cheese and this quality and you've sold this much and make these benchmarks and you've maintained this and that and taken care of the animals that produce the milk, you're good. And we're moving on to the next step. And that's, so to answer your question, Kate, it is possible, but you have to think about it. And on the one hand, you're trying to be as specific as possible. On the other hand, you're not trying to make it so tight that it just gives people an excuse to bail. You missed the quota by a quart, and so you're out. And that's happened. We don't want that to happen anymore.
We
That
actually
help?
Yeah, we have a service that actually speaks to this, which is funny because, yeah, mediators, we usually come in the back end. One of the things that we advertise that people haven't taken advantage yet is contract co-drafting. I feel like that's a mediator superpower. We've seen a lot of agreements that are either not written or very poorly written. No shade. It's, people have their expertise. Um, but the idea of talking about conflict before there is conflict. And so often with these relationships, people don't want to rock the boat. Oh, we finally found a buyer. Oh, we finally found a farm that we really like. And so, and I think, Kate, I actually mentioned, I actually mentioned you like in our one pager on this, if like you're already working with Land for Good or Maine Farmland Trust about this, come talk to us because mediators, right? We've seen like the stuff that we've seen not go well. We've also, as Paul mentioned, like help create and draft wording with people in sessions together. I think co-creation is super important because when you're co-creating an agreement, it isn't one person going, I have this template document, you need to sign this. You create it together and you look over the wording and you read over it like 5 or 6 or 27 times to make sure that it says what everybody agrees that it says. And if it doesn't, we move a comma or we change the wording until everybody's happy. That's kind of the cool part about mediation is that, right, someone's not telling you what to do, you're creating it yourself. And people are honestly, more often, they follow mediated agreements because they had a part in it. Not, it's very different from being told that you have to do this or you have to do that. It's also written in a language that we can understand. And if someone doesn't understand something, we can go in and define it, right? It's all tailor made. And so just wanted to talk about that too. If people are looking at a buy sell, whether within a family or outside, that agreement that you create, we can help with that too. That idea of, well, what are the expectations? I mean, Paul, I agree with you. Anything that's measurable, right? It's oftentimes they're called SMART goals, specific, measurable. I can't remember the rest of the acronym, time-based. But that idea of, yeah, like what is measurable? It isn't arbitrary. It's as minimally subjective as possible. It's not just what did somebody have for breakfast, right? It's or did they not have breakfast and they're just not happy, right? So trying to create things that, yeah, structure, framework. And I always tell people too, whether it's like a pre-agreement or at the end, I think oftentimes there's an aversion to putting things down in writing. It's seen as too formal. It's seen as maybe I don't trust the other person. But what I like to say is, hey, if you guys like that example that you gave, Paul, if you guys don't remember, you can go back to this. If you never have to look at this document again, then like that's the best thing ever. But then if you don't have it, then it's all up to people's, memories, perceptions. We could all be looking at the same thing from different angles. It's the same thing, but we're going to have I also too, I think in having discussions with farmers, there's a difference between simple and clear. I find that like the farmers that I talk to, they want simple. And I keep trying to steer people towards clear. Clear doesn't have to be complicated, but it likely is going to be detailed. And that really getting down to like, well, what if it all goes wrong? And people, like you said, Paul, they don't want to think like that, right? I don't think we're naysayers or pessimists, but the idea too of the planning for the just in case, the contingency, because we're hoping that contingency never happens, right? And so are the people involved. But to have a big question mark there where everybody has to come back together when they're already stressed out, that's really hard. That's hard for our brains to do. To get clear and get grounded again, to like have these discussions over again. So while we're having these discussions, why don't we talk about, and that's the cool thing about people like Paul and I and other experts, we can bring up the stuff that might go sideways. And so it takes that burden off of people within the family or people within the transaction. We can kind of be the bad guys, and that's okay. Like to bring up and we don't necessarily, maybe we talk to like people privately and Jean, I'm just going to use you an example. I'm not going to be like, well, Jane has a real issue with this. I'm going to bring up, so if this issue comes to fruition, or like if this issue comes up, right? I can be that person who brings up the issue that isn't tied to a person or the background, the baggage, the things like that. So that's the cool part about being a mediator. That's one of the things that actually really attracted me to this work when I was in law school, and made me fall in love with it, is the idea of like being neutral is such a cool position to help people structure conversations and come up with solutions that they, we come in with positions. I want. And this helps maybe people take a breath and be able to step back from that. And then also, too, maybe be more open to different ideas or even just looking at their idea from a different perspective. So it's kind of really neat.
I also am thinking too, in this, we've talked, at least in the example of not having identified successor, there's the sweat equity of someone coming in and learning, but then there's also, I think, something that's unique in the world of cheese or value added dairy is that there's so much knowledge from the person who owns the business or owns the farm. I mean, it's not like just like, I mean, Jean, you could speak more to this too. It's like, and you're not selling a cookie recipe. This is like years. It's like a cheesemaker. Every single day you walk in the cheese room, you are changing that recipe slightly based on like what's happening in the environment, what the cows or goats or sheep are eating and all that kind of stuff. And so I'd like to see that more too, as far as like when we're thinking of these contracts. It's also like the mentorship piece too. That is huge. And I don't think that, I mean, if we want to see, continue to see great Maine cheeses out there, we want to make sure that we're valuing that too. Like all the years that it took to create these recipes, because you can't like find them. I think that that's another thing too. It's like there's a lot of information out there on how to like grow carrots and how to do this stuff, but it's like, I don't know, Jean, it's like if you want to learn how to make a specific cheese, I mean, unless you want to pay thousands of dollars for some French consultant to come in, so I think that there is like just that in a work contract too, in that training process, there is that piece as well. However that's valued is one thing, but I think it's just something to kind of consider in this unique situation.
And there's
Right,
different
no, that
things. I
makes
mean, I
sense in
know
getting people committed.
I
You
was
were gonna
thinking,
say something, Jean, I'm sorry.
oh no, I was just thinking that Lainey Fundiller of Lazy Lady Farm in Vermont she came last February, I think it was, and gave a workshop. That was our last workshop here. But she was actually giving her recipes away because she wanted them to continue because she's thinking of retiring. So, yeah, there is that too. I never think of my recipes as being worth anything. It's just, or your knowledge. So it is interesting view.
I mean, they definitely are, so.
Paul and I would call that intellectual property. And
Right.
it's so vital.
I
Yeah,
think
the
that some of
value-
the situations that we've seen with some Maine cheesemakers too, I mean, I think that it's like there's all these different components. I mean, a lot of the cheesemakers that started very early on were farmsteads, so they had a farm. You have the actual like creamers, so you have assets, and then you also have the intellectual property. You have a brand, you have recipes, you have labels and stuff like that. And so it is complex, And so some people are interested in selling the whole entire thing. And I think even Paul, what you said, it's like the generation coming in, like how can you afford to buy all of these things, And so I think that people are starting to think about piecing it together differently, maybe just selling the brand, selling the land. And so I think it's very important for the people in these positions to think about like, well, why do you need to do this? Why do you want to do this? I think every succession case is unique and hard, but for me, I just feel like this is particularly challenging.
Oh, for sure, and that's why we haven't talked about it yet, and Kate, if I'm ahead of the game, let me know. But that is when people, let's say someone does, like Jean has a farm. And just as an example, you have the land that you raise the goats on and the crops, whatever. But then you also have, as Kate just described, you have the business side, you have the brand and the labels and the marketing and the product and everything. And so I often suggest to people, particularly in a situation like cheese making, where you have a product that, again, I'm the paranoid one, things could go wrong. You could have a bad cheese and somebody gets sick. And so I suggest that people create an entity to run the business, to hold the business, whether it's an LLC or a corporation is a legal and accounting question. But the idea is to separate the business from the property or the assets that are being used by the business. So even for somebody who's just starting out, particularly, they think it's going to work and things don't work out. They haven't lost the land, they've only lost, quote unquote, lost the business. And that way also, if something happens and they get sued, you're always going to have insurance, but as a secondary defense, you'd have your entity, and that way you'd at least have somewhere to go home to at night. Because you've maintained, you've kept the farm. So those are issues. And then as you described, Lucy and Kate both, when it comes time for the succession, there's a value. And Jean, this is for you right now. There's a value to your recipes. We know that the recipes, as Kate describes, are going to change because you tweak them and make them better depending on different situations. But there's a basic value to those. There's also a basic value to your 40,000 people on your mailing list that you send out emails to every week. And you have your newsletter, there's a value to that. And there's a value. So those things have to be factored in. Maybe they're not going to be factored in at quote full value because then nobody could afford it, but they need to be brought up as part of, yes, you want to come in and take over this business or buy this business from us. The business is not just making cheese. And to sound crass, anybody can make cheese, but it's making money making cheese. That's the key. Okay, and so that's where that value comes in. So just a thought, as part of that process of putting things on paper, recognizing what is it we're buying? Are we buying the brand? Are we licensing the brand? Are they buying the business, but you are going to get paid for them to use your brand for a certain number of years in a licensing agreement? The same way, if they're buying the business, but they're not buying the land that the business operates on right now because they can't afford it or it's not ready for that part of the transition, they're going to pay rent. Because even though you stop farming, a person still has to maintain some income source. And that's a way of maintaining income is by renting the land, renting the property, the kitchen, all the different pieces that you use in creating the product. And so by having those separated in legal entities, then you're able to work it out for each other so that the seller benefits, the buyer benefits, and actually it should all be a win-win situation. It should never be a situation where one totally obliterates the other, because in the end that never works and the whole thing goes down, and we're trying to avoid that in Maine. So.
Well, it's interesting because we looked at doing an LLC at the beginning, and we were told that any good lawyer could get around an LLC on a farm. So we haven't done an LLC.
That's okay. I get it. And you sought out advice. You were given advice. Again, the positive, negative, and you made a decision. That's all. I mean,
maybe it should be. I mean, as you say, it's a different situation if we were going to now transfer. So maybe we should do an LLC. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, see, then that raises another issue. So the one is liability protection. The other is transfer. Okay, right now you're probably, Jean, you're probably doing things as a DBA, a doing business as sole proprietor. Yeah. Right. So if you bring somebody onto the farm and they're going to take over for you, and you say, okay, at the end of each year, we have benchmarks. At the end of the first year, we're going to give you 5% of the business. As a doing business as a sole proprietor, that means you have to write a bill of sale and give them 5% of each piece of equipment, 5% of this and that, okay? Whereas if for transition purposes, you create an LLC, then when the year comes, you give them a piece of paper that says you now own 5% of an LLC. They're called units. In a corporation, they're called shares. And you now hold this piece of paper, which gives you 5% ownership of everything that we put in to the LLC. And it just makes that transition that much smoother and that much easier. And also much easier to measure, because if things come in or go out of the LLC, the person holding the paper, whether it's Eugene holding the other 95%, you hold ownership of 95% of whatever's in that entity. Rather than, oh, right, there's that piece of equipment and this new thing in the kitchen and and another thing that we just bought, and how do we factor that in? You know, do we own 100% of the refrigerator, or does he own 5% of the refrigerator? It sounds silly, but when things get down to it, it's like, what do I own? And you try to explain to people, well, you own 5% of everything, but you can't separate your 5% out. But from a transition standpoint, an entity, and depending again, from an accounting standpoint, whether a corporation or an LLC treated like a corporation makes sense, that's an accounting question, but that would enable you to more easily transition the ownership of the business. And the same idea of creating an entity to hold the land. At some point, when you get to a certain age or a certain level, you can begin transitioning that. And maybe you're blessed and you have family that, while they don't want to farm, they would like to continue ownership of the property, and they don't want to turn it into a housing development. And so you can transition that ownership in a way that's easily done by certificates to your family, and transition that. There's always, entities are a tool, and depending on what the object or what the goal is to accomplish, you're going to use that in a certain way. So from your initial conversation and your discussion, it was, hey, we have insurance, we'll go with the sole proprietor. That's fine. But now we're thinking of transition. What's a better way to transition? And maybe now the LLC becomes an important tool to do that.
Well, and I think while you're talking about too, there's like this intrinsic connection between legal and financial. And that's and so Jean and everybody else out there watching, we also have a personal financial coaching program that we do. And people talk about everything from we have a CPA that we work with. Her name's Allison Bishop. Again, this is a no-cost program. It's $1,000 of financial coaching. And we've worked with everybody from terrestrial farmers to aquaculture farmers. I think there's been a few cheesemakers. But it's really nice too, because oftentimes, right, those funds are commingled, especially in a sole proprietorship. An LLC says we need to separate those. And just the idea too of transitioning away from farm and personal, it's moving towards personal. And that idea of, and what's really fun is, guys, I vet people very thoroughly. I worked with Allison when I was a mediator. She's actually my financial coach as well. And and now she's working with our program. What's cool about what she does is kind of talking about money. Oftentimes the dynamic is lendee, right? We're talking to people about money oftentimes when we need it. This is a different kind of setup. This is talking about money in a way, whether it's building your savings or, like I said, retirement, building your credit score. There's kind of, it's kind of whatever people want to talk about, but it's that idea of, well, what are our goals? What are our goals in the next 2 years? What are our goals in the next 3 to 5 years? What are our goals in the next 5 years and beyond? How do our personal finances line up with that? And just, I don't know, do you guys have discussions like that on a daily basis? Because I never did until until because she has you do the normal thing of, like, what are your assets, what are your debts, what's ingoing, what's outgoing, what are your monthly expenses. But looking back, and that idea of having a conversation of, well, what do I really want to do with retirement, or when do I want to retire, and how do I get there? So again, that's another kind of thing that we can offer. There's also CPAs out there who do that as well, who might be part of your team, and that's a paid member of your team. But yeah, being able to look at not just for tax purposes or for business purposes, but those personal purposes, I think, are also really important. Because we talk about the money transitions with retirement and things like that, but we all often don't or aren't prepared for the personal side of things of what are we going to do with ourselves. Um, and I think, yeah, right. She's like, yeah, that hits. My parents may have recently retired. I may be, from a little bit of, not from farming, but from other professions. And I think farming is even more consuming. Again, that lifestyle, not just a profession. Yeah. So there's different components to think about. And actually, Kate, we had a session the other day about our personal financial coaching program. And Kate really aptly said, wow, this seems to be a piece that's really missing in succession or transition. And so we're trying to bring it in. So thanks for the platform, Kate.
Well, and I think too, I think a lot of the cases that we see is that for one generation, like personal finances and farm finances and creamery finances are kind of all intertwined and stuff like that. So that is a step, is to try to extract that a little bit, I mean, even just like the lifestyle piece, when I was working to take over a cheese operation, like they had an hour and a half where they just left, and I was like, well, why do we have to let the curd sit for that long? And it's like, oh, because we go have breakfast. And I'm like, I'm not gonna go have breakfast. I don't live on the farm. Like, I'm gonna I want to get going. I want to get, it's like, so it's just like, I mean, even that was like the recipe had to change, because I'm not gonna wait for the cream to rise. I'm not gonna do all these things. And so I think that, that's just like a one little example of how things are going to change lifestyle, it's like, it might be different from one generation to another and stuff, so, but yeah, I think that first thing is really, if it isn't super clear, the personal and the business, having that, and especially I think, I mean, the financial piece, being able to really clearly understand on the farm side, like I said, I think cheese is like, we really have like three businesses with a lot of cheesemakers in Maine. We have we have a dairy farm, we have a cheese business, and then we have aged, an affineur, or someone who ages cheese. And it's like a lot of them are trying to do it all in one. And then they also have their life. So it's like a whole, it can get very complicated very, very easily and stuff. So yeah.
Well, and I think too, right, it isn't just the outgoing generation. We talk even about succession planning starting earlier and earlier. So it's one of those things too, like financial coaching isn't just for people who are on their way out the door, possibly like Jean, right? At least with the dairy farming. Other adventures await, Jean, right? And
Yeah.
but the idea too of right, even planning for that next generation, because like oftentimes, Kate, you talked about, I think Paul, you talked about too, there's kiddos coming up with that family too. So oftentimes we're talking about that third generation, and whether it's paying for college or other things that are going on there, or starting to, the transition plan and having things in order for when they have the succession discussion, hopefully earlier and often too.
I had a call today that was 4 generations. And so, I mean, like the
Oh.
grandparents are in their 90s and they're talking about how to transfer it to their kids that are in like their late 60s. And it felt like we're doing all this work. I was like, why don't we just skip those people and just move down to this group? It felt like it's like we're gonna spend all this time figuring out how to train. It was so complicated. There was like, oh my God, Paul, we need to call you. It was just like there's this land, it's held 85% with this, and then there's this thing, there's a family trust. It was so complicated. And I was like, there was at this point we had 14 names going around. I'm trying to scribble out a quick little family tree, like, wait, whose brother is this? And it was getting so and then that's when I realized, I was like, how old are these people? Anyways, it can get really complicated for sure.
Out of the frying pan into the fire. Well, and that's why they call us, Kate, right? Because if it was simple, they'd do it themselves. That's right. And it's really awesome though, too, that they did reach out, which is so great.
Yeah.
But it's like conducting. I think that, that's why it takes a while. I think it is a process. We would do a disservice to people to tell them like, this will be quick and easy. Just simply, I hate those words. It's not. There's nothing simple about it. But again, like, you wouldn't want a simple cheese. You want something that's complex. So like, that's right. The good stuff.
Totally. If you look at my notes. Talk about that. I was gonna say too, I don't know whether, I mean, we've talked about some specific tools, but I think a big piece in all of this too is there's a housing crisis in Maine. Housing is a big piece of this whole entire thing. I don't know whether, I mean, this is for either one of you guys, but as far as like some of the tools that are out there for like in like the legal structures, as far as, maybe like a life lease, life estate, kind of like talking about some of those things of like, you know, it's a part of retirement planning, but as far as like, where are you gonna live and how can that next generation continue to farm? You know, because a lot of times there might not be housing available. The cost of building a house is just so crazy these days and stuff. So I guess maybe in some of your experience, like what are some of the resources and tools and examples that you've seen as far as like trying to keep land farming and keeping people, I mean, I was talking with a farmer about this the other day and they weren't able to live on the farm. And as hard as farming is, the cherry on top is you get to sit on your porch and watch your animals and stuff like that. So I guess, yeah, how does housing kind of fit into this?
So there's a couple of issues there. We'll start with one, and that is several times where I've dealt with people, they have addressed it in terms of you have the original farm home, and then as mom and dad are going to age out, they plan, those who plan, will plan to build a smaller home on the property somewhere else, but nearby, so they can sit on the porch and watch everything that's happening. But that takes planning. Sometimes when people are acquiring properties for the farm, there might be a house that comes with that new property that they're purchasing. And so again, they might use that as secondary housing. Oftentimes what I've seen is that the older generation years down and the new generation moves into the old farm because it's bigger and can support a family and space, etc. So that's generally what I've seen. Now, another issue that comes up is nobody wants to talk about dying, but also nobody wants to talk about nursing homes. And so one of the issues that I've had to deal with and have felt comfortable and confident in dealing with is how do we protect the family farm land and property and home from being taken if somebody has to go to a nursing home and does not have sufficient assets to pay privately for the entire time they're in the nursing home, where costs in Maine range from anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 a month to be in a nursing home. And so then we will do what we call elder care, elder law planning, and many times in using a unique irrevocable trust that is what I call a Maine Care Asset Protection Trust, designed specifically to hold assets and ideally like farmland that allows the parents to give property away to the benefit of their children, but with controls that protect the property from their children's or whoever the people are running the farm, taking over the farm, from their lives. So rather than deeding something directly to someone, they're going to create this trust. The trust allows us to give the property away. In Maine, when you apply for Medicaid, what is branded as Maine Care in Maine, there's a 5-year look-back period. And if you give the property away and don't ask the state for help for 5 years and at least a day, but hopefully at least a month or more, then that property is not part of the conversation and is not at risk from Maine Care estate recovery. Now, another issue that comes up is many times people in the past, and a lot of times family just kind of does what their parents did and we're just going to pass it on that way. So a lot of times parents will transfer property rather than creating a trust. They'll transfer the property directly to the next generation or the people taking over. It doesn't have to be family. And they will retain what's called a life estate. Now, a life estate is a legal right for somebody to stay or have control of the property during their lifetime, even though they do not own 100% of the value. And so oftentimes people will deed the property, retain the life estate that allows them to stay there. As I tell my clients, if you create a trust and your kids are smart, they're going to Airbnb the home, Airbnb the farm and put you in a tent in the backyard. So we don't want that to happen. So with a trust, we created what I call a tenancy agreement, which is a simple agreement that says as long as mom and dad continue to take care of the place, the upkeep, the taxes, the insurance, the utilities, then they cannot be removed from the property. This becomes important because if they did have to ask Maine Care for help after 5 years, Maine Care is going to go back and look at their checkbook and they're going to see payments were made for the taxes and insurance, et cetera, which are not inexpensive. And Maine Care could say, was this a gift or was there something in writing? And we would come back with, there's an agreement in writing that said if they did not do this, they could be kicked out. So therefore it's a responsibility. And then Maine Care accepts that and they check it off their list. Now, why is this important? The difference between a life estate and a tenancy agreement in Maine is significant. And I belong to a national group of attorneys called Wealth Counsel and Elder Counsel. And I have a friend in Idaho that about 5 years ago now, was presenting at a conference where he explained that he had done what was typically done in Idaho. And that was the client wanted to turn the property over, protect it from Medicaid and the nursing home, and retained a life estate in that property. And a life estate has a value, and it's based on the person's life expectancy and the value of the property. But for our purposes, let's say it's worth 20% of the total value of the farm of this property being moved. My buddy's client died, and the state Medicaid came in and said, we want to do a state recovery. We want that 20% value of the life estate. And my friend said, there's no life estate, he's dead. And the state came back and said, no, the rule is the split second before he died, whatever he had control of, we can go after. So they took it to court. At court, they made their arguments. The judge ruled not only did the state get the 20% life estate, but because the life estate was a connection to the property, he allocated 100% of the value of that property toward a state recovery, which effectively blew up the whole plan. And as my friend described it, they both jumped to their feet, him and the attorney general, and said, or assistant attorney general, and said, but that's not what we asked for. And the judge said, I don't care, that's what you received. And it went up to the equivalent of the Supreme Court in Maine in Idaho, and the Idaho Supreme Court agreed with the judge, which meant that 100% of the property was available. Now we transition to Maine. In Maine, Maine follows the same rule. If a person has any interest whatsoever in property or assets at the split second before they die, those can be subject to a state recovery. So my point is, you need to be very careful if you're being told that you should do a life estate versus a tenancy agreement or some other agreement in order to protect your property from the issue of long-term care or state recovery. So these are issues that people glibly and blithely talk about, well, I'm going to keep a life estate, without recognizing that there are potential downfalls. And other ones are very blatant, where I've had people where the mom or dad will go into the attorney and say, I'm thinking about giving the farm to my son. And then they come to me and they say, how come my son kicked me out? And they show me the deed, and the deed says they gave him 100% of the property. It's not theirs anymore, and they have no control. And so these are things that people need to be aware of, that when your words are important, and I'm sure Kate, you and Lucy and Jean, you'd agree, and others on this that will eventually see this, words are very important. And there's a difference between a life estate and a tenancy. There's a difference between 100% ownership and joint ownership. And so there are ways that you can transition, but being mindful of what are the results of my method or mode of transition. That makes sense, Kate?
Yeah, Lucy, do you have anything? I have some questions, but you want to add something?
Oh, I literally just want to echo, like, it's plan for the worst, hope for the best.
Mhm.
So I think again, oftentimes it's seen as pessimistic, but like that worst case scenario of like, you don't think your child's not gonna like let you on the farm, and then all of a sudden, like, right, there's nothing in writing that says that you could do that. So it's the idea of like, right, planning for the worst, hoping for the best. And also too, even in Paul's story, if they had won the case, litigation is devastating. It's devastating financially, it's devastating emotionally and mentally. it just takes so much out. So the idea of seeking legal counsel ahead is a lot better than seeking it on the back end, even if you're quote unquote in the right. So, yeah. And you do take that chance, and people, that's the thing, right? It sounds like they consulted an attorney, Paul. They did what they knew to do, but then
Right.
that case set a new precedent.
And it was, right, and it was traditionally what was done. And the reason that both of them jumped up was because they didn't want to make bad law. They wanted
Yeah,
to,
that's what
have
happens.
something that people could
Right?
work with. And then just as a generalization, I always tell my clients, this is a generalization. I'm not picking on particular people. But a lot of times in transition and succession, the issue is not necessarily the family member who's involved, but the in-laws. Because the in-laws do not have the historical background of the family. They don't know about all the nights when Jean stayed up with her goat kids and nursed them and kept them going, and through the winter, and all the hard effort that goes into it, and the months of no money to support things because we're just getting started. And all they see is this spectacular cheesery that's got a website and it's got a location and it's in stores and it's everywhere, and they think you're rich, and they push that their particular partner should be the one that benefits the most, and forget about the other adult children that are in the family. They never put in the effort that he or she did. So just a point, getting it out there that we need to be aware of the full family dynamic and relationships, and not that in-laws are bad. We're all in-laws. However, just
And I think that that's also where, say, what are some of the things that kind of people get stuck on? And I think that is a piece of like the people who are involved, either family members or, that aren't necessarily going to be like a part of this transition or be a part of, how to kind of create, how to include them in like just this process in general. And then how is it going to be structured once it happens? Because when it's held by one party, I think it's maybe a little bit clear, but then once we kind of go down to the next generation, it can get a little bit unclear because, these two people have been working side by side their whole entire life, whereas these two kids weren't, so I think that those are some of the things that, it gets brought to light when you're trying to work through this stuff, and kind of being incredibly challenging. And I see people in a great way wanting to create these entities, to kind of include people in that. But I think it's also at the end of the day, like farming doesn't make a lot of money, as we see. It's like there's not really, it's hard to include people in these types of business transactions because it's not, there's just not a lot of stake, in the game.
Well, and the idea too, some people want to plan for if they're in-laws now, they might be outlaws later. There's always that idea of like divorce, not that it wasn't a reality in the past, but if you look at the statistics now, as someone who's divorced, guys, I'll be the poster child, like it's there. Like, so that's also, right, family transitions, even within the transition, and the idea of people not wanting to lose pieces of the farm versus pieces of the business. If there's family transitions within that next generation as well. So not to get like too complicated because we'll get all cross-eyed, but the idea of all of those things are considerations that people address or they see as a non-issue issue. And again, I'm just like Paul, and especially as mediators, like people make decisions with the best information that they have at the time. There is no right or wrong or otherwise. But the idea of bringing up these conversations and just talking about these uncomfortable things, talking about what if, not what if, when someone passes away or needs long-term care, what if, right, inheriting generation, or right, somebody gets divorced. Like we're able, I think, to like help facilitate those conversations again, because it doesn't carry the baggage of somebody within that family or within that team bringing that up, because that can create a lot of bad blood. So, yeah, as an outside perspective, we can oftentimes talk about those things, and we're also trained to talk about them in a gentle, professional way. It may or may not land. You can't control people's responses. You can only control your delivery of it. But the idea would be is this could happen. Let's explore this. And if it's a non-issue issue to them, if it's a hill they don't want to die on, then we move on. but it's something, yeah, the considerations, the what if.
Great. Well, I feel like I think we're a group of people that could talk about this all day. And I feel like, I mean, we're essentially creating a recording and, we're kind of treading towards maybe creating a Titanic movie, someone's going to watch this is a 4-hour long conversation. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I want to kind of get to some closing thoughts. I don't know if you guys have any kind of like last thoughts. I definitely want to, Lucy's shared some, resources, and I'm going to click those links and make sure we can send those to people along with the recordings. And Paul, I don't know, also too, I feel like people are I think that in the work that I've been doing just so far being in the state, having someone who has your skill set and expertise is very valuable. So I don't know whether you're taking clients currently or, if your firm is, but I think that if we could pass along your information as well, if you're open to it, I think that'd be really great.
Sure, no, that would be fine. And the other piece, Kate, is that I'm sure if you went back and found the bio that you realize that I've been working with several other attorneys with Land for Good in New England, putting together the workbook, putting together the workshops, putting together things, and trying to train other attorneys and accountants and other people how to support agriculture in this situation. And ironically, it's not any easier than trying to find successor farmers. It's trying to explain to people
Succession
that
problem,
this
yeah.
is a valuable subject, a valuable area of practice that you can be making a difference in.
I was actually reviewing before the call. I was reviewing some of these. We have a lot at Land for Good, a lot of publications. Of course, they never show up in like my blur screen and stuff. But you were like one of the co-authors on one of it too. So yeah, Paul's
Well,
been.
I wasn't tooting my horn. I was trying to make the point that
But no.
Land for Good has been trying for a long time with conferences and Zoom calls and education and the resources that you're going to talk about on the website in order to train other professionals, and also, same idea with Lucy and training other mediators and people who can support the situation. So
Exactly.
you had other questions, I'm sure, before you want to end this.
What'd you say?
Wind it up. You have other questions, don't you, Kate?
Oh, I'm sure. I like I said, I have 1,000 questions. I mean, like I said, we could totally talk all day. I mean, and like I said, I feel like I mean, not that, like I said, I'm not trying to cut this short. I am just kind of conscious of the fact that like at this point we're creating I was hoping more people were going to join and kind of like and ask questions as well and stuff. But no, like I said, I think there's a lot of I want to share too some of the resources that we have because I think also too it kind of goes there. I know that one of the ones that we have talks about we have a whole guide on how to find, if you don't have an identified successor, and it talks about some of the business entity stuff, as far as like some of the stuff that we've already discussed and everything. But no, like I said, I feel like, I mean, like I said, I'm not, I don't know if others have questions, but yeah, I totally, we could keep talking, but yeah.
I'm gonna
Jean
defer.
must have a question.
Yeah, I was like, Jean, you're a representative here. And no pressure, but the idea of, because you've got to be bouncing all this stuff off of your own situation, and not that you have to share personal.
You have to unmute.
You have to unmute.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my father, I had an older father in New Zealand, and my brother probably would have taken over the farm, and generally there it was the one person got the whole thing, it was just, but my dad got to 65 and decided he wanted to retire, and my brother was at university doing veterinary science. And anyway, it is interesting talking to my cousins that usually the son got most of the farm and the others didn't, or the other children. But so here it's not, I mean, our children don't want to take over the farm, but they're interested in the land. But it's good just to know what options are there. I mean, and to just ask these questions, as you say, to bring it out into the open and to get people's ideas of what we want to carry on with. There's so many other small farms around that, that are not transitioning into the family. So it's just interesting to me to find out what options are out there. I know Maine Farmland Trust has done a lot of work with that too, and MOFGA, but it's hard if you want to stay on the land. Or if and I know several farmers who that is the case, that they either just shut the business down. Usually it's been dairy farmers that I know, but and there's another one that's coming up. So, but anyway, I think it's just good to think about, yes, and to think and to learn what other options are available.
I was
And
in the previous, oh, sorry, go for it.
No, and just to think of some things that you don't even think about, I mean, so yeah, I should pick up some of your resources, Kate, and go through it.
And like I said, in the last week's session, I used myself as a case study because I was in and I provided the timeline of the farm that we were looking to take over. But I think that one of the examples that I gave is that I was in Vermont. I was farming in Vermont, and when we started, there was 4 dairy farms on it was like a 4-mile dirt road, and by the end there was 0. We were the last one to sell the cows, but there was I did that because I showed like a news article, and it was like success, these farmers and cheesemakers found someone to take over, and it was like 4 years later, it's like they failed, but what I was saying was that like the other dairy farmers, I think particularly, it just, no one knew about it. They just kind of there wasn't, not that we need media to be telling these stories, but I do think it's really helpful for people to understand, particularly in dairy, that it can be very silent, and all 3 of the other farms that went out, stopped milking cows, I should say. It was because of family transition problems, that they were having. And so, and I think that it was, and to see that like when people are driving by, there's still cows in the barn, there's still, crops being, grown there, but it's just other farmers are getting bigger, too. And I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing, and I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think that maybe the public doesn't understand that either, that it's actually a little bit easier just to have a lease with a giant 2,000 cow dairy down the road versus trying to figure out what's going on in your family. I think we have a better system set up for that, and also dairy farming is just hard. It's people are losing money every single year doing this, and so I think in some examples too, we've seen people do value added and cheese making as a way to bring in the other generation to be able to pass it down to the next generation too. I see that a little bit less and less these days, but I think in like the early 2000s, late 2000s, that was kind of something that we were seeing, was that value added dairy was a way to kind of pass the farm on to the next generation. So, but that's
yeah, I agree, Kate. It's those small farms that need to be kept, and I just don't know how that's going to carry on here. It's just so hard.
It's very hard. And I think that also too, it's important to kind of just say that. I think it's kind of unpopular to say that, but it's just the truth, it's incredibly hard. And when you talk to farmers out there, it's always a challenge, it's like every year, like last year is always a challenge, but there's something about it just feels like harder than it's ever felt. It feels, but does that on a high note. Sorry about that. No, but we can do it. No.
Well, we just want to encourage all the farmers that are working out there, and it's
well, and I think too, like so I think even going back to what I was saying before, it's like the farmers need to know that these resources do exist, and so I think that some of the partners we said, like Maine Farmland Trust is an organization in MOFGA, or boots on the ground kind of organizations. I think you mean extension. I consider them a boots on the grounds kind of organization. Like you're actually going to farms and seeing people. They need to know that these resources exist, that there's people out there that want to help with this, because I think that. And I think a lot of what we do is like kind of keeping the pace going, it's like we're cheerleaders, we're all these things, but it's like, I think that, what we've kind of said this whole entire time, it's so much of it's preparation, and the other part is flexibility. I think that that's one of the, it's those two combined together, that are so important for this, and that there's so much help out there. A lot of it is just making sure that people hear about it, like I said, my husband goes to all the farms and he breeds, and I send him with my business card, just because after they ask whether, hey, will you buy the farm? He's like, no, I won't, but you can talk to my wife, you know.
Well, and I think it's countercultural in a way. The more I talk to farmers, oftentimes people don't get off the farm very much because of all the work. Plus, as Americans, we're stubbornly independent. And so the idea, and farmers, I think even more, because there's so many hats to wear. So it is relatively countercultural to reach out for air quotes help, right? Assistance, information. But I think too, like, I know I can turn the faucet off and on, or if something's a little bit loose, but I'm not going to do my own plumbing. And so I think there's a point too where, as things have gotten highly specialized and more complicated, there are experts out there that do that work. At oftentimes, especially in the farm area, no cost, low cost, or subsidized. And that's a really important part. We want our farms to continue in their structures in place. It's the idea of, yeah, I'm the same as Kate. I think helping people to understand what mediation is, and then also just the idea, it's so funny because when people come into mediation and then they exit, they come out kind of with a way different, like, that was so helpful. And it might not even be within agreement, right? What success is being there and reaching out and helping, whether it's someone to talk to, just to try to, get some understanding, get some resources, whether they come out the other end with a complete agreement and everyone's super happy. Yeah, that going outward is really tricky, but it is so vital. And the sustainable, if we don't sustain our farmers, we don't sustain our farms. And a lot of this stuff is super stressful. And so the
And
idea
also,
of, yeah, going out.
I also just like to tell people that there are people out there that want to take over these farms, because I also think too, there's just like a tape that's playing and of just like, kids these days kind of thing. And I feel like 90% of we have an intake form, and 90% of the intake forms that I receive are from people who are looking to farm, so it's not looking at people leaving. It's not, we have people who are looking to transfer their farm. There are people who are looking to make their land available to farmers. And then we have farm seekers, and 90% are farm seekers. So people who are looking for this opportunity. So young people want to do this. And so I think that that's another reason why people don't like, if they don't have someone in mind to take over their farm or their cheese making operation or their value added dairy, whatever it is, they think there's no one out there. And they are out there. It's just connecting them.
Back to relationships. Look, guys, we brought it full circle. There it is.
Okay, Kate, so should we wrap up then?
I think we'll
Okay.
we'll follow up with all these resources, all these great resources, but thank you so much, Lucy and Paul. I really enjoyed this. I think this was so
Thank
great.
you.
It was, it's like I said, the topic I think we could talk about all day, but I hope that people, kind of got a better understanding of also too. I think that like also a takeaway of this is like, that this is a team approach. There's not going to be one person that's going to help you with your succession plan from start to finish. You do need to bring in multiple people, but it's also really helpful to have people who have, kind of more of a generalist perspective and stuff. And I think that we have a really great panel here to help with that. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. It was really, I know for me, very helpful. So
You're welcome.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
All right, everybody, we'll see you at the next session, which will be about marketing and your value-added dairy. So we'll talk soon. Take care. Thank you to our experts. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.